And welcome back to America Can We Talk. As I mentioned before the break, we have a great guest in our studio, John Guandolo. He happens to be a family friend. He lives here in Dallas, but he's also a very accomplished former member of the FBI, former agent in Washington. And the reason I wanted to have him come in tonight, I actually happened to have him on a different show that I did last week, and we talked a little bit about this FISA warrant process, and at that point, the memo had not been released. But here he is tonight. I want to have him start. First of all, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I would love to have you tell our listeners because in your time at the FBI, you actually filled out FISA warrant applications in order to seek to have the FISA court issue a warrant. What's involved in the process when you do it the right way?
Well, I think to start, I'd like to just kind of lay it out for your listeners and your viewers. So FISA, F-I-S-A, is Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. So it's an act of Congress. It's lawful. The FISA judges are real judges. There's not a fit. When we talk about the FISA court, we're talking about the collection of the judges because there's not a building they all go to. These are federal judges that come from the federal bench, including the appellate bench, chosen by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court oversees it. So it's lawful and it's constitutional, and that's the first thing. And I bring that up because there are some who consider themselves patriots and conservatives in the United States who think we should do away with the FISA court, and that would be devastating, and I'd like to explain why first. So the FISA court was established specifically to keep from the government from actually doing unlawful surveillance on citizens. So the whole reason it was created was for the exact opposite reason that people are thinking it needs to be done away with. It is constitutional, and what it allows federal agents to do is simply do the same thing we do on a Title 18 warrant, but do it lawfully in a classified setting under Title 50. So here's how the process works. I was a supervisor at FBI headquarters, and during that temporary duty as a headquarters supervisor, I was the affiant, or the individual that swears out the affidavit for a warrant. In this case, many FISA warrants. It was actually a joke. After my time was up, I got a certificate that said FISA man because I had done so many.
So you're really an expert, yes.
I certainly had my share. But here's the process, and this is, I think, really important for Americans to know. The agent in the field would contact his or her supervisor at headquarters. And in this case, I'm obviously using me as the example. So the region that I covered as a supervisor, those agents that wanted to get a FISA would contact me and say, here's the case summary, here's the affidavit. And then what I would do is work with that agent literally line by line, because I have to swear that what's in this affidavit is true. And my professional career, everything's on the line. And so we would literally, both over classified email and phone calls, would make sure that I'm satisfied that every single thing. And you need to understand, some of these FISA warrants are over 100 pages, the affidavits. This is no small task for an agent in the field or anybody involved. Then once once we've got that agreed to, then I work with a Department of Justice attorney and with Department of Justice officials. There is a cover sheet on the affidavit that has to be signed off by DOJ. And in addition to that, the FBI director himself or the deputy director, and in certain cases, his appointed person, but normally it's the director, has to read it and sign off on it himself.
Let me ask you something. Does the director ever say to you, hey, John, you're the one that reviewed this. Why do you believe, what's the evidence on this? Why do you believe this is true?
All the time. There were several cases because sometimes, because of the nature of the FISA warrant, there were times when we had to literally work continuously to get one approved because of some important event or threat or something like that. And so wasn't unusual to be at the FBI director's home on like a weekend. And yes, he'd read through it and he'd say, give me more information on this fact, or give me more information about this source. How long has this source been working with us? What do you know? Now, these are questions I had already gone through with a case agent, so I knew the answers. But I mean, it is incredibly intricate and very detailed. Now, once the FBI director has signed off on it, the Department of Justice has signed off on it. Now I go with the DOJ attorney into the judge's chambers, and now the judge goes through it and will ask questions and may send us back to get answers. And then eventually the judge signs it. And so here's a couple things. One of the questions I get a lot is, how come for all the applications for FISA warrants, almost all of them get approved and people have said it's just a rubber stamp? Well, if anybody heard what I just said in the last 5 minutes, it's not a rubber stamp. By the time that affidavit gets to the judge, it has been through such a screening process between the agent himself in the field or herself, the supervisor at FBI headquarters, DOJ, the FBI director, and then the judge. So, of course, most of them that get to the judge are going to be approved, the vast majority, because of the process. Those are the first two things I wanted to get out. The process is lawful and constitutional. It is a rigorous process that is needed for our national security, and it's important. But then the third thing, relative to the current events, and I'll let you ask the questions, it helps people, I think, without me even answering further questions, understand why in the case of the memo involving Christopher Steele's dossier on Mr. Trump, why that was so wrong based on what I just shared.
I do want to get to that. I love, and thank you so much for that detailed explanation. I think it does clear up a lot of rumors that flew around about, they were just slapdash issuing warrants. So somebody or somebodies inside the FBI and above them, the FBI and Department of Justice, had to have followed this process you described, or corrupted the process. But either way, the process was supposed to have been followed.
Correct.
Okay, so on the particular thing we're talking about here, the other kind of preliminary point I wanted to make, my little lawyer head is going to this, but if you have a system like this, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act is about either you think a citizen is a spy, and so you're spying on the citizen, that's at Section 1 or Article 1 kind of spying, or there's the other kind where you're saying it's a foreign agent who lives here, but that foreign agent, is interacting with Americans. So you're really surveilling this foreign agent, but you just happen to pick up some communications with regular Americans. And the only reason it's relevant is they claim Carter Page, the one against whom they got this warrant. It was in Article 1. He was alleged to be a spy, which is rather astonishing. At least in the memo it says that. The other thing that was really interesting in the memo was making the point, how you come in America to trust the justice system is because there are two sides presented. Every time you go to the judge, the plaintiff has a lawyer, the defense has a lawyer. They go back and forth and back and forth. This is no back and forth. This is one party, the FBI, going to the FISA court to get this warrant, which means the FISA judge has an especially important obligation, recognizing there's no one there representing the one they're trying to get to. So he's got to be double sure that the law is being followed, there's a fairness, there's an accuracy here, because there's no one else weighing in on that at the time of the issuance of the warrant. That's
right. So two things, that's a beautiful point to make. Two things. Number one, the legal standard is probable cause. It's not beyond a shadow of doubt, right? It's probable cause. And that's a relatively simple legal standard to meet on these kinds of cases when we're talking about FISA, when we're talking about American citizens or foreign agents. We're talking about counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations primarily. They don't have to be, but even the financial and economic and intellectual property cases we're talking about, those are generally counterintelligence cases, or can be. So that's the first thing, is the bar is probable cause, regardless of whether there's an attorney for the subject of the investigation, which there never is. It's the same thing when we get a warrant, a search warrant, or an arrest warrant. The legal standard is probable cause. The other thing I would just like to say is nowhere in this case with Mr. Trump, with the dossier written by Christopher Steele and paid for by the DNC and Mrs. Clinton, has anyone alleged that there was any impropriety by the FISA judge.
Okay, and at that point, I'm going to jump into it. We got to go to a break, but I hope you're loving this as much as I am. Debbie Georgatos, America Can We Talk, John Guandolo in the studio. Come right back after our break. And welcome back to America Can We Talk. Okay, I have in studio, I hope you've been listening tonight, I have in studio John Guandolo. He is a former FBI agent and a supervising agent in Washington. And the first thing I wanted to go through, because I think this issue, it is so much bigger than whether or not some people in the FBI had a slightly faulty application for a FISA warrant, even whether they use a political thing for it. It just really, it gets to the core idea of whether we have a rule of law in Washington and that everyone's subject to the same set of laws, and that we have the courage and backbone to investigate when it appears that things were done that were improper. And that's what I want to turn to next. So first of all, I'm just curious, John, so this past Friday, Devin Nunes, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, decided over the protests of the Democrats in Washington to release this memo, this 4-page memo that laid out what he felt there were improprieties after years or more of investigation and calling witnesses before his committee, improprieties in the way the FBI went about applying for the FISA warrant. So overall, was it a bad decision to release the memo? Good decision? What was your sense of it?
I think it was a good decision for two big reasons. Number one, for those who argued it could damage America's national security, I don't know how our national security could be damaged any worse with the level of corruption, sedition, and treason going on at the levels of our government. So that's the first part. The second part is as important, that the American people need to know the truth. The American people are smart enough and savvy enough to understand, and it's what separates our system from all others, is that the openness in our system. It doesn't mean we're foolish with sensitive material and sensitive information. This is something, and the other thing is, I think this is the tip of the iceberg, but this demonstrates that there was willful perjury on the part of DOJ and FBI officials. There was sedition, in my opinion, by these officials, which means that's likely there's also treason. And that goes for Director Comey, who perjured himself, committed crimes, and people need to go to jail and be punished for this.
Okay, let's. I'd love to get back to those conclusions. I mean those thoughts, because I may not be with you on treason. I can go with sedition, but anyway, let's get back to what was so wrong with what the FBI did in this case. And remind our listeners very quickly. Hillary Clinton, during the course of her political campaign, hired Fusion GPS, a smear campaign research company. They hired Christopher Steele. Christopher Steele composed, seemingly out of thin air, perhaps he did some research, but composed a dossier which was full of allegations about President Trump, now President Trump, claiming essentially that he was subject to, he committed wrongdoing in Russia and subject to blackmail. So that dossier, written by a British spy, became the basis. What was the big issue released in the memo was that became the basis for the FBI's application for a FISA warrant in this case. So what's wrong with that?
More things than we have time to discuss, but let me hit the highlights. Number one, the FBI and DOJ, according to the memo and according to other information, presented that knowing that the information was not only false in and of itself, but knowing that they were intentionally withholding information from the FISA judge that would have discredited the information that was already in that they knew was false. That's a crime. You're perjuring yourself when you swear that what's in here is true when you know it's not. The information that was omitted, that the investigation has demonstrated the DOJ and FBI knew to be true, and they omitted it because they knew by omitting it, it will give the FISA warrant the best chance of getting signed by the judge. It's incredible. This is incredible.
I mean, what a deviation from the process you were describing in the last segment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, the other thing is there's a bit of a battle going on about, the memo is claiming, the Republicans are saying that the FISA court never was told, for example, that this was paid for by Hillary Clinton research, that it came from a British spy, that they hadn't been able to verify virtually any of it. It was unverified by them. All of those, is that the kind of thing you're talking about when you say that there were omissions in what they filed?
That's right. I mean, the first thing is they didn't admit that Christopher Steele himself was demonstrated because of what they knew even before this, of providing false information. So he was not a credible source for this kind of a thing. That right there is a huge deal. You would never put a statement of facts or a fact from a source into a FISA warrant if the source had been discredited or demonstrated that they didn't have credibility.
I'm telling you, one thing that came out, and I can't remember. I mean, there are a lot of sources, and I'll tell you, folks, if you're listening, you go to americacanwetalk.org. Many of the links the stories we're talking about have links up there. But specifically, with respect to that issue you were just mentioning, Christopher Steele had mentioned to, and I don't know which person it was involved with the FBI, but had mentioned to them that he really, really, really did not want to see Donald Trump president. He would do anything to have Trump not be president. I mean, president. Doesn't that by itself just signify almost overwhelming, non-credible bias?
It does, but the other thing I would say is that what we see from people in the FBI and DOJ involved in this, they also had that bias.
Okay. Well, and speaking of bias in the FBI, I do, because I'm glad you're here to counter what we're going to play next. But there was a clip that was, now naturally CNN goes to find the one FBI agent who, hates President Trump and loves loves Comey and all that. But there was a clip from this FBI guy named Phil Mudd, played on CNN, and I believe we have it ready to play.
So the FBI people, I'm going to tell you, are ticked. And they're going to be saying, I guarantee it, you think you can push us off this because you can try to intimidate the director? You better think again, Mr. President. You've been around for 13 months. We've been around since 1908. I know how this game is going to be played. We're going to win.
Okay, that is, if you didn't realize what I said before we played the clip, that's a retired FBI agent, Phil Mudd, well-named Mudd, name as in name is, and he is on CNN essentially threatening President Trump that you want to pick a fight with the FBI, you're going to lose. What's your reaction?
How much foul language can I use on this?
None.
Let me tell you, Phil Mudd is a turd. That's what he is. And let me explain this to you. When I put together, first of all, when he was the executive assistant director of the FBI. Okay, so he's not just some guy. And before that, he was an assistant director in the FBI. When I put together my first training program in 2006 on the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic threat, and all of that, we intentionally brought Phil Mudd in on the second Monday after the entire audience of FBI, CIA, DHS, police, local police, state police had gotten 5 days of what this threat's all about, and then brought him in because I wanted to show a contrast of FBI leadership versus the facts of the real threat on the ground. And he got peppered with questions about why isn't the FBI designating the Muslim Brotherhood in or pushing to do so in 2006. What ends up happening is he's sitting there with his cup of coffee and he's like, okay, goodbye. And he walked out and he got followed to his car, to their credit, by both federal, like Capitol Police, another federal police and local police peppered him with questions like, sir, these are real threats. What are you doing? And when he drove away and everyone came back in the room and settled down, I looked at the class and I said, that is what we're dealing with right there. Okay,
that story really buttresses or ties into what we're saying about him right now. He doesn't want, it's like fingers in the ears, la, 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 la. I don't want to face reality. I don't want to face a threat of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't want you guys telling me something I don't want to deal with. And in this case, he doesn't want to deal with the facts in front of him on the memo and all the evidence because it makes the FBI look bad. And he just rather say, la, 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 I don't want to hear it.
Well, but you've got him literally, as you said, he just threatened the president of the United States. I mean, I'd love to see the Secret Service put handcuffs on him. Anyway, I mean, this is just, it's such arrogance. And what he's not saying is the director of the FBI, both Comey and Mueller, but let's stick to Mr. Comey, perjured himself. This, at a minimum, what happened here with the dossier was perjury by an FBI supervisor at headquarters and a DOJ official. You've got tampering with a federal election. And when I said treason earlier, this is sedition because these actions are done as a part of a larger movement to overthrow the United States government.
The duly elected president.
Absolutely. That's treason if you hold office or you've sworn an oath to the Constitution.
Okay, and on that note, I will tell you something else because we have just a few seconds left in this segment. I did look up this Phil Mott. I couldn't believe the things he said. This threat to the president that we just heard played. He also, he's obviously a big anti-Trump guy. He was out previously with a statement relating to the travel ban, which he didn't like. He called it, I'll say it nicely, bass-ackwards. He called the Trump transition a clown show, and he said labeling the Boston attacks as intelligence failure is absurd. This is Debbie Georgatos and John Guandolo. America Can We Talk? Come right back. So John Guandolo is here, and we were talking again. The FISA, the memo came out last week from Representative Nunes in the House Intelligence Committee, and they laid out what they felt were the at least a surface 4-page summary of the problems they saw, the serious legal, really constitutional problems. So some of the gripes about it, John, I'm just going to ask you to react to them. These were gripes that came from, besides Nancy Pelosi, who had a meltdown many times and just talked about national security secrets and danger. I mean, first of all, you read the FISA memo that came out from the Nunes committee. Is there any national security problem here?
No.
I mean, it was so absurd. And that's the thing is, I kept thinking, even when they were saying that, this is not about location of the nuclear codes, hidden assets in our...
It's about the corruption that people like Nancy Pelosi have participated in for years.
Yes, yep. Okay, so, but here was one. They had, the memo is intended to undermine, this is a complaint about the memo being released.
Right.
The memo is intended to undermine the special counsel's ongoing Russia investigation. What do you say to that?
Well, I would hope it does. Now, that's not the intent, though, of releasing the memo. But, of course, it undermines Mr. Mueller's investigation. Number one, to get a special counsel, there actually has to be a listing of what the crime is that he's supposed to be investigating. So far, that's not been done to even initiate the special counsel, number one. And now we know the very thing from which the statement of facts came from, the dossier, was fabricated, is untrue from a source that prior to this being filed with the court, the affidavit being sworn out, was from a source who had been totally discredited.
Yep.
So it's unreal.
Well, on that point, I'm glad you said that because the answers, I'm reading from a questionnaire that the House Intelligence Committee put out, and they were trying to address the most frequent, most common criticisms of their decision to release the memo. And I didn't actually care for their answer to that question because they just kind of said, well, the memo has nothing to do with the special counsel's investigation. So to reiterate, because I want to make this really clear, there would be no Mueller investigation had it not been for this astonishing conduct on the part of the FBI and Department of Justice in securing a FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page based on a fantasy written by Christopher Steele and funded by Hillary Clinton. There'd be no Mueller investigation. And, John, I'm glad you pointed that out, too. I've had former federal prosecutors on the show pointing out, you're not even supposed to have a special counsel without a clear statement of what crime has been charged. There is no crime charged.
That's correct.
Collusion is not a crime.
No crime really even indicated at all.
Okay, here's another criticism. The memo is intended to undermine the Department of Justice and the FBI. So actually, basically what Mudd was saying in that clip we played last segment, that's what he would say is you're undermining the Department of Justice and the FBI.
Well, that's not the purpose of the memo, number one. The purpose of the memo was to put out truth about what is actually going on, letting the American people know that senior leaders at the Department of Justice and FBI lied, committed crimes, intentionally perjured themselves, tampered with a federal election, committed sedition. I think those are things Americans need to know. If some of those people involved were in the FBI leadership and DOJ leadership, they should be skylighted. Americans need to know this, and these people should be charged and punished.
So what about the people in the FBI? This isn't one of their questions, but, you have people that were FBI Director Andrew McCabe is mentioned, Deputy McCabe, and Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. What about people who aren't at their level, but they saw what was happening? They worked at the FBI, Department of Justice, but they really weren't part of it. Do they have some obligation to speak up?
Yes, they do. I mean, when these kinds of laws are being broken and this kind of sedition is occurring, you have a constitutional oath, and quite frankly, from a policy standpoint inside the government, as well as a moral duty to speak up. Absolutely.
I was thinking about that too. That in many walks of life that happens. You could work in a bank, a law firm, but most people, even if there weren't a law like you're describing, you take an oath to uphold the laws and Constitution. An ethical person knows you have to speak up. If you're a police officer and something is unlawful or unethical occurring, you have to speak up. Which gets me to the broader point I want to get to. I feel concerned, back to my original opening, Trump running for office and talking about draining the swamp. I feel concerned this culture of either not, a elitist that says we know better, Trump can't be president, he doesn't deserve it, so we're going to get rid of him. And then also just it's an elitism, and then also maybe I don't even know what word to call it, but a sense of culture permeating the FBI saying, well, they seem to think it's okay, so I'm not going to speak up. It's like a culture of lawlessness. Is that too broad, unfair?
I don't think it's too broad or unfair. What I would say is, and what I encourage your viewers and listeners on, is it's not, I would not describe it as a culture. This is a hostile movement. What Mrs. Clinton and Senator McCain and Christopher Steele and the people in DOJ and FBI are participating in is a hostile movement inside this country to take this country down. That's why I use the word treason. It is certainly sedition for everyone involved. It's the same thing. I put it in the same category as fake news. I think when you use the term fake news, you are minimizing what it really is. It is a hostile propaganda operation by people who want to take down the country. And I think to dismiss it as fake news or dismiss this as merely a culture inside the Bureau, it's an intentional hostile movement. And that's my professional assessment. And that's what my company, Understanding the Threat, does, is looks at the hostile Islamic movement, but also this Marxist movement that is working in tandem with them, that actually they propel each other forward.
Yes, they do. And on the subject, you use the expression, this Marxist movement. It's really interesting. Under President Obama, he got elected twice, and apparently, so the people thought they liked him. They thought they liked his personality or his way of speaking. But the American left saw him as a vehicle to move this country radically left, and they saw Hillary as she was the next step in the path, the next one who's going to continue the expansion of power and control of the federal government, the seizing of control through a variety of regulations and laws of more of industry. It was a slow, unspoken Marxist movement that Hillary Clinton would then have been the next step. And even people who supported her, most of them wouldn't call it that. They just thought she sounded nice. But within the mindset of the highest level thinkers, this is what so outraged Obama and many of the supporters in Washington was not just Hillary couldn't win the election, but that this plan and effort they had to move America toward a more government-controlled, loss of freedom, loss of individual liberty society was just cut off at the knees by Trump's victory.
That's right. And it really is when you look at this, it is an arrogance that leads this whole thing, that they know better than we do, that we as American citizens can't govern ourselves. Well, that's why the right to revolution is inherent in the Constitution. It's why it's the only duty mentioned in the Declaration, which is our ideal, is because the social compact we make with the federal government to allow to elect people to represent us and not self-govern ourselves, that compact can be withdrawn at any time. And this is something that Marxists like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Phil Mudd, and others clearly, whether they understand it or not doesn't matter. I believe they do. But this is treasonous behavior, and it needs to be punished to the fullest extent of the law.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I do think the within the FBI, it's funny, you hear it in different words, that in different quotes, the sense that they had, some of these actors, was not that they were doing something wrong, but they were serving a higher, more important goal. And so the fact of violation of law was a minor problem, given the higher goal has to be to get this country back on the track that Barack Obama was taking it. I mean, do you see?
Okay, so yeah, so if we are going to make that argument, I could say if we had lost the revolution, the American Revolution, George Washington and the founders would have been hung as traitors. But we didn't. Liberty won out.
Right.
And in this case, liberty won out when Mr. Trump was elected. Liberty won out because those people with courage inside Congress, and there seem to be very few, released this memo for the American people to see very plainly the corruption, the sedition, treason that's going on. And I think those people have to make their case to the American people that they were violating the law in the cause of a higher calling, except their higher calling is Marxism and socialism and the destruction of liberty.
Absolutely. I'm completely with you. I completely agree. And I love that you're saying all that. Okay, one last quick objection that some people had was this idea that the memo shouldn't have been released because the Department of Justice and the FBI did not agree. I mean, hey, I'm telling you.
What a surprise. The leadership of the FBI and DOJ didn't want a memo release that demonstrates the leadership of the FBI and DOJ are seditious, violating laws. I mean,
yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it is crazy. Well, I just think this is a really, I said this many times on the show, it's a great time to be alive. I used to think when I would read history and people got to be part of the founding of America, and they actually got to be the ones who would stand up and speak up against King George, and they were going to establish the right of liberty, God-given because you were born kind of liberty. That used to seem so exciting to me. And I think, gosh, we're in such a boring time. America's established. But this is that level of dire need for Americans to recognize that your liberty is not permanently yours. You don't have it unless you defend it, protect it, recognize threats to it, and expose them. And this is a great time to be alive to do just that. Well, I had John Guandolo in studio, and before he gets away, I do want him to tell you, he's mentioned a couple times, but what your organization is and what you do.
Oh, thanks. I am the president, founder of Understanding the Threat. You can find us at understandingthethreat.com, at UTT_USA. And I'm at John Guandolo on Twitter, Facebook, Understand the Threat. And we do encourage you to sign up for the newsletters. And we are the only organization in America that provides citizens, law enforcement, state and local leaders with the tools they need to identify the jihadi networks in their locales and tools to investigatively pursue them, and state strategies at the state level to dismantle those networks. And we also identify and map out Marxist networks as well with the same intent.
Love that, folks. Look up John Guandolo. I've taken one class with him. It's fabulous. This is Debbie Georgatos. John, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
America Can We Talk? Come back after the top of the hour.